All right, I think I'll get started. There's still some people filing in, but good afternoon. My name is Dan Snyder. I'm the Associate Director for Research here at the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to a very special convening of the Korean program here at APARC. It's a long-awaited event. I'm going to, before I talk about what we're going to do today, let me just announce 3 upcoming Korea program seminars. So I don't forget, next Friday in this room, Professor Park Myung-kyu from Seoul National University will talk about South Koreans' perception of North Korea issues. On Wednesday, October 14th, Professor Lee Soo-hon will talk about, from Kyungnam University, will talk about Northeast Asia in strategic crisis, North and South Korean responses, so a little bit similar subject matter, but I'm sure quite different views. And finally, in a program co-sponsored with the Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law on November 11th, it's a little ways off, a event looking at electoral campaign regulation in Taiwan and South Korea. So this is always special when we have a book event, because after all, that is the goal of all research, is to produce publication and, most importantly, books. And this is a book that where this is the launch of this book that I know has been in progress for some years, maybe in some sense for many decades of David Straub's life, but it was well worth waiting for. I'm doing a little advertising right in advance, and I need to say it's very important that we have a book table outside, and I'm sure that after this event is over, you are going to want to rush out and buy your own copy, and David is going to sign it for you for free. David Straub, is, I think most of you know, is the Associate Director of the Korea program here at Shorenstein APARC, and he came to Stanford 2007, after a very long and distinguished 30-year career in the Foreign Service, in the State Department. Much of that career was spent dealing with Korea and spending time in Korea. He worked over 12 years on Korean affairs. He first arriving in Seoul in 1979 as a young political officer, and finished up as the country director for Korea, and in between, among other things, worked very closely on the six-party talks to deal with North Korea's nuclear program. He also served for 8 years in the U.S. Embassy in Japan, and was Japan country director as well. And so he's really spent a lot of time focusing on the 2 most important relationships in some ways for the United States and Northeast Asia, our alliance relationship with the Republic of Korea and with Japan. And this is a book, I think, that comes out of David's experience, particularly in the early part of the last decade, 2002, when he was in the embassy in Seoul, and the wave of anti-Americanism that erupted at that time. And this is the first account I think anyone has ever written, particularly from someone with such intimate knowledge of Korea and of the relationship between the United States and Korea, of not only those events, but how they were handled, how they were responded to, both by the United States and by Korea, the Korean public, Korean media. So it's an exploration of the kind of complications in managing our alliance that emerge as a product, I think, very much of, as the title of this book says, Anti-Americanism in Democratizing South Korea. And the crucial emphasis, I think, is on democratizing. That is, what is the impact of democratization on the ability of both governments to effectively manage their relationships. I'm gonna stop describing the book because David is going to do that. And we're really lucky because after David makes his presentation, and Ambassador Kathy Stevens, who's with us now as the William J. Perry Distinguished Fellow in the Korea program here, and is serving as acting director of the Korea program this year, is going to offer her own response and comments on this. And I can't think of anybody more uniquely qualified to do that than Ambassador Stevens, who was also in the embassy in Seoul at crucial periods, including in the late 80s when democratization took place. And she's had 4 decades of experience in Korean affairs, starting as a Peace Corps volunteer in the 70s, and later, of course, as a diplomat, and finally as the U.S. ambassador in Seoul. She's had a long and distinguished career in the Foreign Service that included serving as the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs in 2012. That's following her ambassadorship. As the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, and as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. She served as well in Europe, dealing in Belfast with the Northern Ireland crisis, as well as dealing with events in the Balkans. And she was with us as a Correct Fellow last year when she thought she had retired from the State Department, but it's never over. She was called back into service to be the acting ambassador to India. But we're lucky we got her back for more time, and hopefully not to be interrupted by the president at the will of the president. But who knows? In any case, said she has been dealing with all of the same issues for most of her career, and I think it'll be a great dialogue between them. So. Let's get started, and as usual, the time that's left will be left for your questions and discussion.
Dan didn't mention, but he himself has spent a tremendous amount of time following Korea. His father was the American ambassador to Korea in the mid-1970s, and as a foreign correspondent, Dan covered Korea for decades. He was in Korea when democratization took place, among many other important developments. So I'm also looking forward to hearing Dan's comments as we have our major discussion. I'm really pleased that Kathy agreed to join the panel. I've known Kathy since 1984. She may not remember this, but she succeeded me in some of my portfolios when I left the American Embassy to go back to Washington in 1984. I say without any exaggeration whatsoever that as ambassador, Kathy did more to improve the image of the United States with the Korean people than any other American official ever. I'd also like to thank my colleagues Heather Ahn, program manager for the Korea program, and Debbie Warren, our conference person, because they did a lot of work to set all this up. Debbie, I think, cooked the meal, but we couldn't do this without them. This is my first book. It may be my only book. As Dan said, I spent my entire adult life until a few years ago working at the State Department. And for any of you who worked at the State Department or places like that, you know that you're writing to very senior, busy people. And the instructions you get are 1 page or 1.5 page, no more. So it took me about 4 years after leaving the State Department to be able to write anything longer than 2 or 3 pages. So this was a major challenge, cultural barrier for me to overcome. But it's not my book. It's a commonplace to say that a book is written by many people. Well, this one certainly was. I'm particularly grateful for Dan as the Associate Director for Research here at APARC for his support over the many years, and of course to Professor Shin, now happily in sabbatical in Seoul, who guided me a lot, provided a lot of insight into how Koreans look at themselves and the United States. To George Krompacki, our professional copy editor, and many others. So too many to mention here. They're in the acknowledgments, but I'll be forever grateful for those people. What I'd like to do today is to speak very briefly, because we do have Kathy and Dan, and we have all of you. And as I worked on this book, I felt all too acutely the limits of my knowledge and my own understanding of these events, not to mention of the broader U.S.-Korean relationship. These are extremely complex things. So this is just one person's limited view and interpretation of what happened. But I hope it's of a little significance to at least people, say, in the U.S. government who are working on these issues, to get a first-hand American perspective on the issue, because I don't think that has really been written and published very much. So the three things that I'd like to go over. First, I'll tell you just a little bit about how I came to write this book and about my background in connection with it. Then I'll give you an outline of the book and just give you the gist of my main arguments. And finally, I'll tell you why, even after all these years, I think the story still needs to be told, even when today it's indeed the case that U.S.-Korean relations are probably better than they ever have been. But before I do that, I'd like to ask you a few questions. First question, how many of you believe that there are significant anti-American attitudes and feelings in South Korea? Significant. Okay, a few. And how many of you know this performer? Okay, everybody knows, right? Okay, Psy, doing Gangnam Style. And does anyone know what Psy rapped at this concert in Korea in 2004? Anybody? Now, I'm a little reluctant to show you the next slide. Expletives are deleted, but not so much that you can't figure it out. But it's important that you know or have a sense of how strong the feelings, popular feelings towards the United States were in this period we're talking about, 1999 through the early 2000s. Now, this wasn't just about Iraq and George W. Bush. This came after this period, as I said, I believe began acutely in 1999 and snowballed, leading to such outrageous displays. How many of you remember that he did apologize for this? But of course, he apologized only after he'd become an international sensation and was being treated grandly by all the Americans. So he did apologize quite extensively after that. Okay, another question. How many of you know who these young ladies are? Okay, I'm saying at least half, or about half. Okay, these were Shin Hyo-sun and Shin Mi-sun. They were two, I think, 14-year-old schoolgirls who, in June of 2002, were walking back home, or walking, I think, back from a birthday party with a girlfriend along the side of the road when they were run over by a big tank-like American military vehicle that was part of a convoy then. This caused very strong reaction in South Korea. The Korean media interpreted it to their audience as the U.S. forces and the United States not respecting the Korean people, not respecting even the lives of the Korean people. And they demanded a trial, a court-martial. Now, Eventually, one was held later that year, a U.S. military court-martial, and that two were found not guilty. That was interpreted by the Korean media as, well, of course, the American military is not going to punish one of its own for killing or hurting Koreans, is it? So there was a general sense of outrage, which led to demonstrations like this in December of 2002. This is just in front of the Seoul City Hall Plaza, the main plaza in all of Korea, site of many historic protests and events. And they were tearing apart giant American flags. And this was not just one day. This went on weekend after weekend over a traffic accident. Now, does anyone know who this person is? Anyone? Even our ambassador to South Korea does not know. Which is perfectly understandable. Not for that reason. Because, well, I'll tell you. This man is or was Major David S. Berry. 2 years before Ms. Shin and Ms. Shim were killed in that traffic accident, Major Berry was walking down the street of the neighborhood of Itaewon next to the American military base with a couple of his friends. I should tell you that Major Berry was a physician, pediatrician. He had come to Seoul briefly on special assignment because there was a gap in staffing. So he was there to treat the American military children. Walking down the street with a couple of his friends, and suddenly a sort of homeless-like person came and stabbed him to death with a long knife. He died almost immediately. Now, you would say, why should I raise this subject? Well, the death by accident of Ms. Shin and Ms. Shim, terrible tragedy, was a huge political issue in South Korea. It literally dominated the news for much of the time between the time of the accident in June and the demonstrations in December. And it was interpreted as, this is what the U.S. really means to us. Well, this person, obviously mentally ill, who stabbed Major Berry to death, he didn't do it just because he was mentally ill. As we can tell from our own terrible mass gun tragedies in the United States, these events happened because of a combination of things: the availability of weapons, mental illness, and the cultural milieu in which the perpetrator is living, right? So in South Korea, by June of 2000, we'd already had almost a year of extremely harsh, even vicious criticism of U.S. forces Korea over a series of incidents, many of which I believe, and have tried to document in the book, were at least exaggerated and in some cases actually more or less invented. The mood against Americans and, in general, but USFK in particular, by June of 2000 was very, very mean. And I'm quite convinced, without having proof, that that emotionally ill person was influenced by that milieu, and that, in combination with getting the knife and being mentally ill, is what caused the death of this man. I would ask you if you knew what the reaction of the Korean media was to this, but since no one knows him, I'll just tell you. There was almost no reaction. There were reports about that long in the Korean media. About 7 lines, I think it was, sentences in the Yonhap Wire Service report. Did they report that this young man had, I think, 4 children back at home? No. They did report that the mentally ill man said that Major Berry had accosted him on the street and called him a bastard or something to that effect. They actually reported this. Now, of course, he did not say that. He did not say anything to the man, according to his two colleagues who were walking beside him. But that was the Korean media reaction to this tragedy. What did the death, the murder of David Barry mean to the American people? What did it say to the American people about Korea? Nothing. Because the American people don't know about the U.S.-Korea relationship, frankly. And only the Korean version of U.S.-Korean relations and matters like this is reported, even in the United States. And I'll get back to that more later. So this is a significant phenomenon, and it contributed to much of what I witnessed in Korea from 1999 to 2002. In other words, there's a big discrepancy in the way that Koreans and Americans look at the alliance. Koreans first pay far more attention to the United States and to the US-ROK relationship than Americans do of Korea and the relationship. And two, of course, Koreans have their own national lens or way of looking at the US and other countries, and it's not the same as the Americans look at themselves or Korea or the relationship. So I'll talk to you more about that a little bit later. Next, let me tell you the first of the three items, how I came to write this book. There's a long-term reason and a short-term reason, and Dan covered part of it already, but I will tell you a little bit more about it. I've been working or following Korea basically ever since 1978, when I first started learning Korean in the State Department, all the way through 30 years in the State Department, and then as a researcher here at Stanford since then. But I heard about Korea even as a child. My father was a Marine in the Korean War. He was constantly talking about Korea. So this was, it was not, Korea was not an unknown concept to me. In the 1970s, when I was a young man, Korea was very much in the news in the United States. It was in the news for good reasons and bad. The bad reasons were the controversy called Koreagate, about corruption and bribery involving Korea and American congressmen. But it was also in the news for good reasons, which is the tremendous economic progress that the country was making. So I was interested in Korea even then. But it's largely by chance that I went to Korea. After serving in Germany on my first assignment, I told the personnel people, I'd really like to go while I'm still young to another dynamic part of the world, but one where I can learn a hard language. And I said Northeast Asia would be terrific, and they came back and offered me a wonderful opportunity to serve in Korea and to learn Korean, both in Washington at Yonsei University. So I've spent 8 years in Korea, 6 years on the Korea desk in Washington, and in almost all of my other jobs, I've had an opportunity to follow Korea informally, fairly closely. I met and married my wife in Korea, and so for me, Korea it's really kind of a second home. So one of the difficulties I had in writing this book was, how am I going to write it and be honest and detailed and frank without making Koreans think, wow, this guy really dislikes Korea, or he's looking down on us. And I want to say, I don't at all. I have the deepest respect for Korea and for Koreans' accomplishments. And I don't by any means, in my criticism of what Koreans did and said during this period, mean to single out Koreans. I mean, that's, unfortunately for you, you're my focus, my professional focus, so I'm writing about what I know about. But I could probably just as easily write something far more critical of US behavior in other circumstances. I was very troubled by what I saw about the US-Korea relationship and Korean attitudes toward the United States when I worked in Korea that second time, 1999 to 2002. For those Koreans here in the room, you know it. Probably most other Americans don't. But for as long as I can remember, the American embassy in Seoul is surrounded by riot police buses. That's not a good sign for the U.S.-Korea relationship. Now, admittedly, it's a small minority that causes the police to have to do that. But to be surrounded by riot police buses your entire working career, or at least time in the embassy, it's not a good feeling. And it's not a good signal of what people think in Korea about the United States relationship. I think Koreans probably don't think about that. If I were a Korean, I wouldn't either. Why? Well, we're protecting the Americans, and it's just a minority, so why, don't worry about it. But think about it, if you're working in this atmosphere every day, all day long. When you walk out, you have these hostile people in front of you all the time. So when I left Seoul in 2002, and particularly when I left the U.S. State Department in 2006, I said, I really need to sit down and try to write this up so that maybe the Korean people can look at this from a different angle, from an American angle. But I procrastinated. By that time, U.S.-Korean relations were already much improved. So I figured, who would be interested in this? And as I said, if you're a Korean and you see something like this, and you see, well, Straub, he worked at the American embassy, and he's just defending what the outrageous things that the Americans did at the time. So that made me wonder, should I write this thing? Will it have any effect other than making my Korean friends at least perplexed about me, or at worst, angry? But I wound up committing myself to write this book to Professor Shin, and finally I brought it forth. So there you have it. There's no particular reason for the timing other than procrastination could not go on any further. So now let me tell you about the book's contents and its main arguments. I used the period 1999 to 2002 not just because those were the years that I was in Seoul. I was the head of the political section then. That's the section of American embassies that deals with the foreign ministry and U.S. military relations with the host country, and also covers the country's domestic politics. So I was very, very deeply involved. I spent most of my waking hours working on these controversies between the U.S. and South Korea, particularly involving U.S. forces Korea. And I will tell you in just a moment why I think 1999 is the real starting point. I'll try to explain why the Korean media and the public were so critical of the United States during this period. I think there were long-standing reasons for that, and then some special circumstances at the time. So I do that in the introductory chapter. I try to look at the historical origins, the long-term origins of Korean attitudes toward the United States, basically to set the stage for the rest of the book. And most of the rest of the book is a series of case studies about just some of the controversies in the U.S.-Korea relationship during this period. And then finally, in the concluding chapter, I try to tie all of those things together and explain why I believe there was this outburst of anger toward the United States. Let me just go over very briefly these case studies. All of you have heard about the Nogunni killings, right? Sometimes called the Nogunni massacre. This was a case in the first weeks of the Korean War when the Americans and South Koreans were being chased down almost to Daegu and beyond, when an American unit shot over a couple of days at a huddled group of South Korean refugees. In the fall of 1999, the American Associated Press ran the first in a series of long articles basically suggesting that this was a massacre. And certainly there were a large number of Korean civilians killed in that. It's a very complex thing. It was a tragedy. I won't characterize it any further because it's too complex to characterize in just a couple of sentences. But the way this came up and the particular time at which it came up seemed to me to have been sort of a catalyst for the South Korean media to focus in great detail and with considerable animus on the United States and in particular U.S. forces Korea. Now, why that particular time? In December of 1997, Kim Dae-jung was elected president, South Korea's first ever progressive president. And his election empowered progressives in South Korea, particularly progressive civil society organizations. Not only that, they empowered the younger generation. I'm talking about the so-called 386 generation whose formative experiences were the Gwangju tragedy of 1980 and the rise of Chun Doo-hwan. This generation, that generation, then and even now, holds the United States considerably at fault for at least not having stopped these developments, and many of them feel that the United States was complicit in them. That's another book, a subject for another book, but I'll just state that as a fact. They were and are quite critical. They're the most critical generation toward the United States in South Korea today, even after all of these years. So, empowered by Kim Dae-jung's election, the progressive NGOs and the South Korean media, not just the progressive media, the conservative media as well, went after the United States saying, doesn't the Nogunni incident show what the United States really means to us South Koreans? Now, it's an issue fully worthy of study, and it was a terrible tragedy, and you can certainly criticize the soldiers and the United States at the time. But does something that happened 49 years earlier in special circumstances like that really tell the Korean people what the United States means to them? I think that is highly debatable, and yet that really is the way it was interpreted and treated. The very next day, South Korean veterans filed a lawsuit against American companies that produced the so-called Agent Orange defoliant that was used in Vietnam and we later found along the DMZ. That was a big story. How many of you remember formaldehyde being dumped by the USFK mortician into the Han River? Oh, I know more than that. Remember, I've heard of that incident. Fascinating thing. He violated USFK policy, he violated USFK regulations because some few years before that, as the world became more environmentally conscious, the regulations were changed. But on the back of those surplus formaldehyde bottles used for embalming, which were old bottles, it still said may be disposed of by washing down the drain and diluted in a lot of water. So he did a wrong thing, a bad thing. He should have had some punishment. This was revealed a few months later by a left-wing environmental group in South Korea which portrayed it as the American forces are trying intentionally to poison the people of Seoul. Now, USK forces also drink the water from the Han River. Its interpretation cannot be correct. Moreover, formaldehyde is a poison, especially if you breathe it, as our folks in Louisiana after Katrina, when they got those cheap trailers to live in and had all of that cheap plywood and carpet in it, full of formaldehyde. They got sick by breathing this stuff in. But formaldehyde, massively diluted, is not toxic. It dissolves. It's not toxic. I can recall seeing over weeks and weeks and months of reporting in the South Korean media, that much from one South Korean expert who said basically what I just said. I'm quite convinced all of the other South Korean experts and the South Korean government officials were afraid to speak out and say what they really knew, because the mood in South Korea was so hostile that people, South Koreans who knew better, were not going to be the first to speak up. I'm not criticizing them. If I had been a South Korean then, I would not have spoken up. What's the advantage you get compared to what would be the maybe even physical attacks you would receive? That incident, anybody has seen, what is the name of Kreml in English? The Host. Anybody seen the movie The Host? Okay, that's what that was based upon. American critics said The Host was an excellent movie. And it was fun. The next two case studies are on the Cooney Range incident and the Status of Forces Agreement revision. Cooney Range was the American name for a small target practice run off the west coast of South Korea, where the American pilots would come and do target bombing and target strafing so that they could keep up their qualifications, required qualifications to continue to do their work and keep their status. It's the only one that the Americans had in all of Korea. One day, during this period, an American pilot approaching the island where most of the target practice was done, had mechanical difficulties, and according to standard operating procedures, he dropped his bombs on the far side of the island, away from the mainland where the village is located. The local activist, who had long been trying to get this facility closed, immediately told the Korean media that this had caused hundreds of homes to have their walls and foundations cracked, and that many old people had been injured. Now, imagine, this is the West Sea, the Yellow Sea. Here's an island. A mile farther is the mainland, and the village is over here. 6 bombs on that side of the island are not going to do anything except make a boom. And yet this story, from one source who was self-interested, was carried by all the South Korean media for weeks and months with tremendous outrage. So they demanded an investigation. The U.S. and South Korean military agreed to do a joint investigation. They went down there, they spent many days, they took technical equipment, experts, they interviewed people, and of course they concluded those cracks in the walls, those are from settling in these old houses over decades. None of this stuff happened. So the American Major General, who was a hard-bitten fighter pilot, said, well, we've got our conclusion. And his South Korean partner, who of course understood Korea better, said, yeah, but we have to soften it a little bit. We can't just say that there was no damage. And my American friend said, but I'm not going to tell a lie. Nothing happened. You agreed. Your experts agreed. The Korean general, he was really like this. But he agreed. Okay. And they published this. And the Korean media was outraged. They said, you Americans, how can you possibly be so shameless? This is not about one incident. This is about, the way you treated us all along, and that the existence of this thing, which is so loud and is dangerous to the local people. Well, that's a different argument. Maybe. But that wasn't the argument they made at first. They went after the U.S. in editorials with the most outrage you can imagine, saying that this incident had caused all of these damages. Status of Forces revision. I'll just say that to this day, an overwhelming majority of South Koreans believe that the Status of Forces Agreement, which is the agreement between the U.S. and South Korean governments that says how the U.S. forces in Korea will live and interface with the South Korean government and tax system and rules and regulations. This is viewed by 90% of South Koreans or more as being still grossly unfair to the Korean people. Now, this is in spite of the fact that today South Koreans now have their own forces stationed overseas, and they have copied the U.S. ROK SOFA for their agreements with other countries. I can talk about this later if you want to. Bushwhack. This is a chapter on the great controversy between the United States and South Korea over North Korea policy after George W. Bush became president. and while Kim Dae-jung was still president, and then Roh Moo-hyun became his successor. This is one of the few non-USFK problems that I put in this context. And I do because it is significant. That it really does explain some of the South Korean feelings toward the United States at the time. But now when I go back to Korea and sense how Koreans feel about this, there's a widespread conflation in South Korea of George W. Bush and his policies, whom they did not like at all, and the anti-American protest and incidents that occurred before he became president. In other words, this acute phase started in late 1999. George W. Bush wasn't president until early 2001. And many of these incidents and problems were taking place in the last year of the Clinton administration, when the Clinton administration was working very closely with the Kim Dae-jung administration, both on North Korea policy and trying to be forthcoming on the USFK controversies. Not sporting. How many of you remember that, the short track skating incident at the Utah Olympics? A few. Apollo Ono, remember that name? Well, most Americans don't. This was a huge scandal. This controversy, in fact, had more impact, negative impact on South Korean public opinion toward the United States in general than any of these other things that I mentioned, including North Korea policy. Polls prove it. Now, for you who don't know about this, and all the Koreans do, even though you didn't all raise your hand, Apollo Ono is this a Japanese-American kid, an American kid who was sort of the darling of the American media networks. And he was engaged, there was jostling, and anyway, the Korean hero fell down, or was knocked down, and Ono got the gold medal, wasn't it, that Mr. Kim was supposed to have gotten. Now, the call was made by an Australian. Didn't matter. There were massive cyber protests. Various American media sites were brought down. There were numerous death threats against Apollo Ono. I mean, not just a few, many, many death threats against him. Now, what does one say about something like this? This is the tribalism that we human beings all form an essential part of our being. Now, why were the Koreans so upset about this? I didn't know about it at the time, and I actually really didn't know about it until 2007, when I was teaching a year at Seoul National University, or a semester, and one of my students, an American, wrote for my class a paper on this incident. And it opened my eyes. Why? He said, because, he explained all the details, but the gist of it is that South Korea had basically never won a gold medal in the Winter Games except short track racing for a long time. And it had won a whole lot. Korea was, I guess, leader in the world in short track racing. And most of us Americans didn't even know what short track racing was. So there's an anecdote in the book. Ambassador Tom Hubbard, who was a wonderful man, has gotten a terrible bum rap from the Korean media about his tenure. The next morning, I guess, he went and he gave a speech in front of a group like this. And at the end, somebody asked him, what about the short track racing thing? And he didn't know what it was, basically, or anyway, he wound up saying, well, it's just a sporting event, and by the way, it was an Australian referee. Oh, my goodness. He came into the office right after that. His necktie was like this. His shirt tail was out. I think he was running for his life. He tells this tale in his memoirs. And so he figured out, he still didn't know why Koreans felt this way, but then he said, by God, the next time they ask me, I'm going to say, I feel so sorry for Mr. Kim. This is such a tragic thing. And he did, and the Koreans loved him. And by the way, this chapter is taken from the paper that was written by my student. This is the only chapter in the book I didn't write, and it's the best chapter. For any of you who are interested in sports or this particular thing, I highly recommend it, even if you don't look at the rest of the book. Then Then I write about the deaths of the two schoolgirls. It really was a horrible tragedy. There are some things that U.S. Forces Korea did not do that they should have done. They didn't check their communications equipment before they went on the exercise. So in a literal sense, there was some negligence on the part of the soldiers. Did they mean to kill the girls? No. Did they stand around over their crushed bodies and laugh, as some of the Korean media actually reported? Of course not. They were devastated. And yet the Korean media reported as if these two young soldiers didn't care. That's too much. And I know that the Koreans who knew better were afraid to stand up. But, to be fair, most Koreans at the time were only reading what they hear from the Koreans, from the Korean media, from other Koreans. Human beings believe what we are told by those around us. That's what we are, social animals, and we are tribal animals, and that's the definition of culture, that we basically believe and think the way the people that we associate with on a regular basis believe and associate. So here again is this great asymmetry of attention to the relationship. And finally then, as I said, the concluding chapter tries to tie all this together. I'm talking much longer than I should. Let me go faster. Basically, my argument is that this was a complex phenomenon caused by a concatenation of circumstances, and there were a lot of reasons. I think there is some historical basis for the anti-American attitudes and feelings in Korea. That basis was politicized in South Korea a long time ago. Professor Shin, Gyuk Shin, our director, has written a series of very, very good books about these kinds of phenomena. And he says that in the United States, Korea, I think he's more talking about North Korea, but this applies to South Korea as well. Korea is a policy issue. That is, it's not really a subject of a great deal of public debate or public interest even, because the public says, oh, our officials are going to take care of it. So it's a policy issue in the United States. In South Korea, though, it's not only a policy issue, even much more so, it's a political issue. And therefore, issues that would normally not become public or become a big media issue or a source of controversy, but would simply be handled administratively by the concerned U.S. and Korean authorities, they often become big public issues, which makes resolution much more difficult. And it also gives the Korean people the misperception that there's one terrible controversy after another involving U.S. forces and that the U.S. forces don't respect them. And certainly U.S. forces Korea are not perfect. Over the years, I'm sure they've made many mistakes, and some bad apples have done bad things, but that's not the general picture. The 386 generation, again, in particular, they played a big role. This was their first chance to get back at the United States for the perceived injustice the United States had done to Korea because of Gwangju and Chundu-hwan. Kim Dae-jung's election empowered the left, the civic organizations. Some of the civic organizations on the left actually want U.S. forces out of Korea. Now, I'm not criticizing that. If I were Korean, I would want to have the right to say, I don't think we need them anymore, or for various reasons I want them gone. That's a perfectly legitimate argument or feeling from my point of view as an American, as a former official. But some of these groups and some of these individuals want to get the Americans out, and rather than making arguments as to why the American military should get out of Korea, they exaggerate and invent incidents and try to inflame public opinion so that the eventual result will be that the Korean people will want the American soldiers out. And I should say another word about Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun. Even though a lot of people said before his election that Roh Moo-hyun was anti-American or something like that, I don't think that really was a significant issue. I think for both him and Kim Dae-jung, the fact is they were much, much more interested in North Korea than anything else involving the United States. So they wanted to get along with the United States so that the United States would be more likely to do what they wanted to do on North Korea. They really were not interested in the USFK issues at all. They left those mostly for their subordinates to handle, and their subordinates either were afraid to stand up because they would be criticized by the Korean media in public, or some of those subordinates were from the left or the far left, and they sympathized very much with some of the progressive groups. So the result of this and other factors was that there was a major venting of anti-American feeling and attitudes that had been pent up in South Korea during this period. It ended amazingly quickly. It had been taking place for 3 years. We had these huge demonstrations at the end of 2002. Those helped to elect No Mu-hyun because he was considered tough on the Americans, almost contemptuous sometimes of the United States. But after his election, even before he was inaugurated, No went straight to U.S. Forces Korea headquarters and said, oh, you guys are, I think he actually literally used the word precious. You're precious to Korea. So he was wanting to get this now because he wanted to govern. He wanted to work on the North Korea problem. He didn't need this distraction. It helped him to get elected. He probably was aware of that, but he didn't need this anymore. There was another really important factor which has not been grasped except by individuals in South Korea. When those senior American congressmen and others, officials and leaders, saw the pictures of these American flags being ripped to shreds over a traffic accident, and some of them, when they visited Korea, they were furious. They were furious. And they told top South Korean officials, I'm furious. That sunk in. And some of these top people in the Foreign Ministry and the Blue House and other places said, oh, we've got to manage this relationship. And so people started backing down. Another thing that happened just about the same time was the right, sometimes the far right in South Korea, which had been disempowered by the election of 2 progressive presidents in a row, started organizing on their own. And they started holding counter demonstrations that became increasingly large and vociferous. And that also had some impact. And another one is that No Mu-hyun quickly became very unpopular in South Korea, domestically. Had nothing to do with the United States, a whole bunch of other reasons. So it's very ironic that as critical as South Koreans were of President Bush and how they conflated his election and his attitude with their feelings about the United States, actually South Korean relations with the U.S. public feeling about the U.S. started to improve significantly while No was president and Bush was in office. And I'm not saying this to defend Bush. I want you to know I thought Bush was a disaster as a president, not only in Korea, but even worse in other places. How does one explain these things? Well, I've given you my reasons. I was going to give you a little more about this asymmetry of attention, but I'll just say this. It's a real problem when the United States is trying to involve itself and involves itself in everybody's issues to a considerable and sometimes huge extent. And we get all kinds of imbalances. And one is this imbalance or this asymmetry of attention, not on the part of the government, but on the part of the American people, where the American people just leave it up to their government to run things. If the American people had been engaged in Korean affairs in 1999 to 2002, the situation would not have gotten nearly as bad as it did, because the American people would have stood up on their hind legs and say, wait a minute, that interpretation is not right. We don't feel that way. We don't disrespect you. Those soldiers weren't trying to kill those girls. But they didn't. And so we had a huge problem. And I think this problem applies to all of our alliance relationships, almost certainly. I know it applies to Japan, and probably to a lesser degree to many other alliance relationships. So I'm not arguing that the United States should engage in isolationism, but this is just one more argument that the United States needs to think carefully about its overseas engagements. And if we're going to be engaged overseas, our public has to study and know a lot more about what our government is doing if we're going to have good relations and make these overseas quote-unquote investments pay off for all of us, Americans and our allies alike. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
I mean, David started off to ask you a lot of questions. It occurred to me I should ask you all a question of how many people here like Korean dramas? Quite a few. Yeah, I mean, being here at Stanford with like I say, Dan and with David, it reminds me that actually there's no Korean drama better than what actually has happened in Korea over the last 70 years. I first went there 40 years ago, summer of 1975, and I will remember meeting, he wouldn't remember me, of course, but Ambassador Snyder, Dan's father, who was the ambassador there, who told us young Peace Corps volunteers, the economy's growing and learn Korean and don't talk about politics, and didn't mention that he was engaged in what we now know was a pretty serious effort to stop Park Chung-hee from developing nuclear weapons. But so that was my introduction to Korean drama, and I went back a few years later, as David mentioned, after I'd joined the Foreign Service, and I'd served for 2 years in China, wanted to get back to Korea. Went to meet our then ambassador to Korea when he was in Washington. I was just being transferred from China. It was Dixie Walker. He was a professor from South Carolina of Chinese politics. And I said, in the Foreign Service system, you go into a job. So this is political officer of a very humble grade, Vice Straub. So I didn't know David, but I knew his name. So I said, Ambassador Walker, I'm Kathy Stevens, and I'm going to replace David Straub. And Ambassador Walker looked at me incredibly coldly and said, nobody can replace David Straub. I've never forgotten that.
I didn't know he liked me.
But David and one reason I so value this book is, first of all, it covers parts of the Korea drama I wasn't there for. It's like the episodes I missed. I mean, even though David and I have known each other for about 30 years, we never actually worked on Korea at the same time. So I have this big temptation, which I'm going to resist today, to say, but this happened after you left, and this happened after you left the next time and before and after. But I think that is part of the story that David has made such a contribution to. What I do want to say is another thing I really like about this book is, it gives a sense of what American diplomats do. And also what, if I can say, kind of unsung, really good American diplomats do. I mean, to me, the heart of being a Foreign Service officer is being immersed in the culture and the language and the history of a place and trying to bring that knowledge to bear to try to figure out kind of what's going on and communicate about it and do something about it. David, in a very, very difficult environment, gives a lot of examples in his book of how he does that. And I just say he's the most humble person, as you can see from how he talks about it. But his book, most books people write their memoirs, they sort of fixed all the problems. Somehow David gives some examples, though, which I think are wonderful, of how someone there who actually knows the language, seems like kind of a basic thing, right? There's a lot of times we've been in trouble because we didn't know the language or we didn't know the culture. Of course, David went with Assistant Secretary Kelly, and I gave him a copy of your book a few days ago in Washington on that difficult trip to Pyongyang in 2002 to discuss with the North Koreans evidence of a highly enriched, or suspicions of a highly enriched uranium program that they were pursuing. And as our most gifted linguist and Korean linguist, really brought a lot of insight, because of all of you know, whatever language you speak, it's not just what the interpreter says, it's how it's said, how forcefully, and in Korean, this is the room for ambiguity is perhaps greater between English and Korean than most other languages. David gives a very good example of how I think this hypersensitivity we found it hasn't gone away entirely, although I think it's less, but in the Korean press in particular and among political circles about what we say as officials, what our leaders say. He gives the example of a summit that didn't go so well when shortly after President Bush was elected and met with Kim Dae-jung for the first time. And President Bush at the press conference referred to President Kim Dae-jung as, I respect this man. And that phrase, this man, was taken as an insult by many parts of the Korean body politic. translated as Isram, or even, Inom. And you're not supposed to say that, right? I guess it's okay. And David, as he describes in his book, the response was, and as a Korean speaker, I think he had credibility to do this. He said, well, let's not be quite so sensitive about this. I mean, after all, when he exchanged marriage vows with his Korean bride, she was asked to take this man as her husband. So it is important to have people there who know the language and the culture and have the relationships with people, and that's something that David did over many years. In terms of all these various incidents, I do think that in focusing on these years, it does have to be focused on the context of kind of, what came before and what came after. So I think there's more work for us to do. I was there both before and after you, after you left in '84 through the '80s, and I remember going out. The job that I inherited from David, which I could never adequately do, but it involved dealing with or getting to know students. And labor and opposition politicians, many still banned from actively engaging in politics. And I was lucky enough to be there when the trend line started becoming more positive. But there was still a lot of tear gas. I spent a lot of time, anyone did who was in Seoul in those years, Dan did too, with a lot of tear gas. And I remember fleeing from it at times and sheltering under buildings with other students who they didn't know who I was. They clearly knew I was not Korean, but shared with me their homemade devices that were antidotes to the tear gas. But at the same time, there'd be another demonstration. I remember only one, actually, where I walked out in the street and a student actually threw a rock at me that almost hit me. So that atmosphere can, and of course we had the occupation of the cultural center and the bombing or the burning of the cultural center in Busan as well. I do think that David is right to focus on the notion of a lot of steam built up in those years, and with the election, with the transfer of power, a very welcome thing, to the opposition party. With the election of Kim Dae-jung, there was an opportunity, I think, for a lot of pent-up frustrations, if you like, over a long and bumpy, overall successful, bumpy relationship to express themselves, and he was there for a time that required a lot of diplomacy and a lot of management. I said I wasn't going to talk for long. I wanted to tell more stories, but I actually wanted to, my final response is to actually borrow something I heard, because I've been puzzling over these same issues. I don't have all the answers for years, from someone many of you know, and David knows, and I very much respect, Han Sung-ju, who was the foreign minister and Korean ambassador to the U.S. as well. And I remember him saying some years ago to me 3 things he thought were useful, and I'd like to get David and others' response to it. One, he said, when you think about the U.S.-Korea relationship, there's always a certain tension in an alliance, and its alliance is rather unique in that it's an alliance of one part of a country, of a divided country, against the other part. And that wasn't even true, say, in Germany. And that creates, if you like, fertile ground or natural ground for nationalist resentments and tensions and difficulties. I think, and I have some comments on ways we can deal with that, but I think it's something to be aware of. Second, and again, I'd be interested in your observation on this, David. His observation was that the U.S.-ROK alliance, and here I'm talking about the military alliance in particular, is more valued in times of high tension with North Korea. And one hypothesis might be during this time that you focus on, David, it was a sunshine period, South Koreans felt a little freer to express their frustrations with U.S. forces Korea and with the alliance in general. And third, and this has always been important to me, I think for reasons having to do with the U.S. historical role in Korea, you talk about asymmetry and our military presence there, issues relating to the U.S. In Korea play out more as domestic policy issues than foreign policy issues. And I think we saw that in 2008 as well, with the protests against the plan to lift the ban on importing American beef. And so those are his 3 observations, which I think give me a little bit of perspective, I think, to look at the incidents that you describe, as well as things that happened since that time. And I also think, and this is a final point, I think you mentioned that we've just seen grow more, that that maybe in some ways sort of political movements in Korea are kind of the canary in the mine in terms of the role of the internet, which you talk about, and social media. In mobilizing people in a very rapid fashion. I mean, Korea is this is much talked about, almost ideally suited for that kind of quick communication. But I think that is certain. We saw the impact in some of the incidents that you talk about. I think we see it even more potentially now. So I congratulate you on your book. I hope we'll have many conversations about it, and I commend it to you all. Thank you.
I'm going to resist saying just other than a couple words because I suspect there's quite a few responses out there. My perspective was that of a journalist for most of this period, and I think one of the things that that David raises in this book that's really important, and it certainly came up in his talk, is what's the role of the media in feeding and in some cases creating some of these perceptions of the United States, and that it's not only, by the way, the Korean media. I think the foreign media and the American media as well tended to kind of follow in the wake of the Korean media to a large extent, and it certainly is true that I always, basically say the prejudice, the arguments about political prejudice in the media are usually wrong. It's not about left and right. It's a prejudice in favor of conflict, to tell you the truth. Tension and conflict is the sort of the bread and butter of most journalists to some degree because it attracts attention. So people will say, why don't you write about good things that happen, positive things that happen? And the answer would be because nobody wants to read them. So I think that that's an important part of this story, one we can explore. And the other part is, as I said, is democratization. Anti-Americanism is not new in Korea. I think it probably started somewhere about the time the first Americans landed in Korea in 1945. And a relationship of dependency is always going to be a difficult relationship, and that's not only true in Korea. I certainly have seen it in Japan as well. But the expression of it and the way that it gets spread and deepened at certain moments, I think has really changed as a result of the opening of Korean society. And I was a reporter covering the Democratic Uprising in the late 80s when Kathy was there, and I always sort of look at that in some ways as a shining moment for the United States because we intervened at a crucial moment to stop Chun Doo-hwan from declaring martial law again. And yet the perception of the American role is really just not like that at all for the most part. And that, as I think David pointed out, the generation of people, the so-called 386 generation, I sat in front of the gate of Yonsei University day after day watching, massive battles between students and riot police, and those guys were in power later on during the period that David's talking about, and yeah, they carried some feelings with them from those days, so the ability of these people to gain power as a result of democracy has altered the dialogue. And I think the last thing I would say is that it isn't over. I'm happy about the trends that have taken place in U.S.-Korean relations, but I also am fairly confident that we could easily sink back into problems because there is an underlying, as I said, the relationship of dependency that really is difficult for both Koreans and Americans to manage, and it can express itself easily. So let me open the floor and let things go. I see the hands of our APARC faculty, but I'm going to call on them, but I encourage others here to as well. Carl.
Yeah, two quick questions and for any of you, and David, just a really terrific presentation here. I look forward to reading the book now. Number one, on the media. So Dan, you had said that media likes to talk about conflict and tension, but that said, what David, you're portraying is there was only one side of the tension being reported. Why is it, with this robust democracy that the Republic has, that there, on issues like this, if there's MSNBC and there's Fox, why is there no CNN or BBC or public television trying to report the middle? And the second is on history. How are the Korean children taught in elementary school and in high school about the Korea-America relationship since the end of the Second World War? How do they teach the Korean War? How do they teach the 1980s in the schoolhouses?
Let me take a couple other, maybe do it that way. Tom?
Also terrific, and Kathy's comments very well. I'd like to hear you say a little bit about the democracy dependency dilemma. What you focused on was the asymmetry in the relationship and how that plays out, and maybe notion of victimhood and so forth. But how much of what was going on was a product of a process of democratization and then the maturation of democracy, that the breaking free of an old regime in which the United States was viewed as a primary supporter, that suggests that sort of as democracy matures and has matured, that the anti-American component would diminish, despite the asymmetry and dependency. Dan's suggesting maybe not. What do you think?
Go ahead, why don't you respond?
Okay, to your questions, Carl, about the media. This was just, even in South Korea, 99 to 2002, this was just the beginning of the internet being really big. And it did play a significant role, but most of the media at the time, internet media at the time, I would say, is pretty progressive. And actually, they did terrible things like actually publish photographs of the crushed bodies of those two girls intentionally to cause a huge reaction and get readership. They did not at the time have the proliferation of channels that we have in the United States. And related to Tom's point, this was to some extent a temporary, a venting of the lid on this pressure cooker was being lifted by Kim Dae-jung's election indirectly. And so, and the 386 generation was the biggest generation, I think, in numbers. And so this is, in some sense, a transitory thing, a venting of steam. Now, the media situation has changed since then. Now they have a huge number of cable television channels. They have a Chosun cable that explicitly tries to copy Fox. I assume they have more liberal ones. The media, everybody, all kinds of online service, and we still have all of the print media as well. And since 2002, as I said, the right has begun, even without the support of the government, as it used to have, began to organize itself to have counter groups to some of these left-wing organizations. So the situation is quite different today in many respects, media-wise, and the feelings and attitudes are quite different because the conservative media saw the damage that was being done not only to the US-ROK alliance, but to the conservatives who, in the popular mind, are more associated with the US alliance than the progressives are. So now the conservatives are not entirely, they can still say some really nasty things about us. Things that if the American people paid attention, even today would make the American people mad, but it's much less than the progressives are doing. As history is very interesting, I do not know the answer to the question about what is exactly being taught, but this today on the evening TV news in South Korea, there's a huge controversy boiling because the Park Geun-hye conservative government is trying to have one conservative history textbook be used by all of the students, in contrast to the current situation in which I think there's 7 textbooks which the conservatives say could have been written in part by the North Koreans. So,
Yeah.
What's the root cause of this strong hatred towards America from Korean media? Besides you mentioned the media loves tension and conflict. Besides that, what's the root cause?
I don't want to give the impression that the Korean media hates the United States. I don't think that even most of the progressive media hates the United States. I think a lot of historical perceptions that no longer apply are still being used, a sense that Korea is a victim of all great powers, including the United States. a desire to make news. This is a political issue in South Korea. So there are a lot of reasons. For most Koreans, it doesn't add up to hatred of the United States or the American people. And interestingly, even though during the period I wrote about, according to some polls, large majorities, were saying nasty things about USFK, and they were sometimes the numbers of those who said, we should get rid of USFK, they went up. But I'm pretty sure that a lot of that was just Koreans felt this is a way to vent steam at the Americans by answering the polls this way. Within a year or two, all the polls were back to saying 3/4 of the Koreans want the Americans to stay there indefinitely. And now it's like 80%. So it's not, there are elements of a love-hate relationship. But as I put in my book, Koreans focus, especially the Korean establishment, left and right, among all the countries in the world, really on the United States. They send their children to Stanford and all of the American universities. So it's not that they hate the U.S., but I think Americans know they don't know anything about Korea, right? They know there's a good Korea and a bad Korea, but which is it, North Korea? I don't know. But Koreans think all Koreans, everybody thinks that in the world, everybody thinks I can be an actor. You watch movies, I could be an actor, I could do that. Of course, you can't. Virtually all Koreans think, I know the United States. I really know the United States. And I'm sorry, but I've talked with the top people in South Korea, and 99 out of 100 of them have some bizarre views that I just know from my personal experience are just absolutely incorrect. And they're about important things like the U.S. secretly wants Korea to remain divided because that way we can cause a problem for China and sell more military arms to South Korea. It's just ridiculous. And yet, very smart, very senior people believe that. I heard a senior progressive person, an advisor to Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, say that in a podcast just yesterday.
At the risk of sounding like I'm still trying to be the U.S. ambassador, I really do think that, first of all, yes, we can't take it for granted. This relationship and the fact that we work on major issues together. We have a lot of troops there. There's going to be issues. But I actually think through this process, we've developed a lot of resilience. And I would just use one example. The formaldehyde in the Han River and how that was responded to. Just over the last few weeks, there's been this case of, I think it was anthrax, sent to a U.S. base in Korea. Turns out actually it was sent to a number of others as well. So this has been reported. You probably have followed this more closely than I have in the Korean press, but what I've seen in the Korean press is it's been reported in a pretty straightforward way. Have there been some columns that said, "How dare the Americans, not tell the South Koreans when this happened? They should. How dare that it happened anyway?" Very much some of the same conversations. These were our service people also at risk by it. But the fact is it didn't. It's kind of the why didn't this dog bark question. And I think one of the reasons is because the media has matured. There are more opinions out there. And I think that the ability on all sides to try to kind of manage things in an appropriate way has grown because of these experiences.
Don?
The subtitle of your last chapter, David, is Forgotten but Not Gone, question mark.
Yes.
Kathy's remarks just now suggest that it really is gone. And your comment about the diversity of the media would point in the same direction. In trying to explain anti-Americanism in Korea, as I go back over your talk, it seems to me there are domestic answers or explanations, but then there are also external ones. So this is unfair, but if we look to the future, is it possible the Republicans, let's say, God forbid, win next year, and we get a hardline American administration that escalates tensions with China? Can you say anything about the likelihood that these circumstances could reproduce perhaps a little bit of the George W. Bush phenomenon in South Korea and rekindle, quote-unquote, anti-Americanism?
Yes. A very good question. I do address this toward the end of the conclusion. Of course, it has to be highly speculative. This is too complex to really make a good prediction. But I do frankly say that there could be, not in the same way, and probably not to the same extent, an upsurge in anti-American feeling in South Korea under certain circumstances. And one scenario I can imagine is particularly over in North Korea. When I was there a decade ago and Clinton was president, he and Kim Dae-jung got along swimmingly on North Korea policy and a lot of other things. And I think there's still a lot of, in Korea today, most progressives are embittered by what they see as the United States screwing up with the Sunshine Policy. They particularly blame George W. Bush and his administration, but they blame the U.S. more generally. They're not happy with Obama. They've been quiet about it because Obama is quite popular in South Korea, and it's kind of hard criticizing Obama when North Korea's behavior and words and deeds are as bad as they've been over the past few years. But if a progressive, or when a progressive is again elected to the Blue House in the foreseeable future, that president will pursue a sunshine policy. And I think a lot of progressives think that, oh, if we get another Democrat in the White House, that those two presidents can work together. They don't understand that the American political system and parties have moved beyond that. There is no longer any willingness to negotiate with North Korea unless North Korea begins to show some sincerity about negotiating. So there could be a real serious diplomatic problem which could spill over into public perceptions over North Korea. But that would apply primarily in the case of the progressives coming to power in the Blue House. I think there's a broader, longer-term, deeper possible problem, which is over China. Both conservatives and progressives in South Korea are very nervous about so-called being sandwiched between the U.S. and China. And they're not completely happy. Nobody is completely happy with the way the United States is dealing with China, as well as not being happy with a lot of things that China does. So you hear a lot of talk in South Korea about, as during Nomuhyun, about South Korea somehow balancing the U.S. and China. I have yet to find an American official or very many American citizens who like the idea of our ally, South Korea, having the presumption to say, well, we'll balance between these two superpowers. Aren't you an ally? So that's the kind of reaction. So I could imagine that whether a conservative or a progressive is in power in the Blue House, if the U.S. PRC relationship worsens, and particularly if the U.S. is seen as mismanaging that relationship, that we could have some serious policy differences that, again, could have some implications for South Korean public feeling about the U.S.
Well, at the risk of cutting off conversation, I do want to end it here to allow you to rush to the corner outside and buy your own copy of this book, and for David to go out there and you can continue a conversation out there. And I hope that I'm sure that this presentation and the discussion we've had should encourage you to do that. And for us, I think we're just grateful that David's here and that he has written a terrific book. And I want to thank everybody for this conversation.